Hey guys, it's Tom here from Metalloud, and today I want to talk about something that's not music related, but another one of my hobbies or passions, which is video games and technology. Specifically, what I want to talk about today are the current generation consoles that we have. And that would be the PS4 and the Xbox One. Now, we're about 2 years into the life cycle of these consoles, so we're not going to see a new generation for a while, probably not for at least 5-6 years at this point, but it's never too early to make predictions. So before this generation was released, a few months before it, I actually wrote an article about my predictions of what we could expect from the consoles that we have now. So first of all, I just want to go over those and kind of see where, did I get them right, and, how close was I with things. So here we go. So my first prediction was a pretty simple and pretty obvious one at that point, is that Blu-ray was kind of going to be a way for the future for disc-based games. And the reason being is because at that time especially, there wasn't any kind of other format that would allow them to actually make games the size that they are today, where we're talking about 40 gigabytes and 60 gigabyte games. There's no way to fit that on any other kind of traditional disc-based media. And I didn't think that the consoles were quite ready to go all digital yet. Even the PC still hasn't reached that point where it's entirely, discless. It's definitely getting there, and pretty much at this point we're about 95% on the PC. Very rarely do you find people buying games at the stores, actual physical copies, and even half the physical copies that you buy still require you to download the game to your computer in some way. But I didn't see that the consoles were quite there yet, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Internet connections aren't quite there to be able to download them. You're talking about either slow internet service. Broadband was just bumped up to a minimum of 25 megabits a second, which still isn't that much, for a base internet service. And a lot of the services have caps on them and things. Not to mention, there's a whole used games market that would just suffer without any kind of physical media as well. So it kind of made sense that these generations of consoles would use Blu-ray as kind of the standard. Last generation probably wasn't as necessary. Games weren't as big as they are today with the Xbox 360 and the PS3. The PS3 had the Blu-ray, which kind of gave it a little bit of advantage, especially in terms of being a media powerhouse and not just a gaming console. And I think, at that time, the 360 didn't need to have Blu-ray. That's kind of helped it keep a price advantage throughout the whole last generation, but it is kind of a necessary thing for this generation, and that's exactly what we saw. Both the PS4 and the Xbox One both have Blu-ray drives. My next prediction was that the consoles would be powerful enough to set a 1080p standard resolution. So for the last generation with the PS3 and the Xbox 360, majority of the games were really 720p or sometimes even lower. Occasionally a game would kind of bump it up a little bit. A few games kind of approached 1080p. There were a few games that were at 1080p, usually kind of lighter, not as graphically intense games. But generally speaking, the last generation standard was really 720p. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that when they were released, the 360 released in 2005 and the PS3 released in 2006, most people really didn't have high-definition TVs at that time. It was something that was just starting to kind of become big. 720p was kind of that standard and that kind of entry level, especially for people who are going to be buying a console. They were most likely looking at a 720p TV at that time to play it on. 1080p was still pretty expensive for most people and pretty much out of most people's range. So it kind of made sense that their target would be 720p. It was still kind of future-proof at that time, but at the same time it wasn't out of reach for most consumers. Now flash forward to this generation and almost everybody has a 1080p TV. That's basically the standard. People are just starting to get into 4K TVs at this point, and even they are dropping in price dramatically and pretty quickly as well. So it makes sense that this generation's target would be 1080p, and here we are, and it pretty much is. Most games that are being released on these current generation consoles are targeting 1080p. Some are even targeting 1080p 60 frames a second. Of course, you get some games that probably are rendered a little bit lower. There's some games that are rendered lower and upscaled to 1080p, which is kind of a trick that the last generation used often. But overall, we get here and the target rendering resolution is generally 1080p. So one of the biggest problems with the last generation was their proprietary hardware that they had. Not only did it make them a little bit more expensive than they probably needed to be, it also made it very difficult for developers to kind of harness the actual technology that was in those consoles. And that's particularly evident with the PS3 and its Cell CPU. But even the Xbox 360 featured a PowerPC core, which wasn't generally the standard. It wasn't that x86 based core that most developers were probably used to. Most coding programs are written for, and it's also a reason why many ports that we got on the PC from the consoles were pretty poor, just because it was hard to kind of translate it, and it was too expensive to just redo it over and develop it for the PC specifically. So as the consoles kind of pushed more and more towards being gaming PCs in a simple format, it kind of made sense that we would see not proprietary hardware, but kind of off-the-shelf hardware. And my prediction, I basically said that they would either choose, normal CPUs and GPU setup, or we'd see something like AMD's APU, which is exactly what they have. They actually both feature AMD's APU technology in there, which is a CPU and a GPU kind of combined. And it benefits everybody in a sense, because not only does it make it easier for developers to make games for those consoles, and also it makes it easier to kind of have a consistent quality between the two as well. It also makes it cheaper because they're not training people to work with some kind of technology that they're not used to. They don't have to buy all these developing tools that they might have needed for the past, and it just makes developing these games a lot simpler. And again, it makes porting to the PC a lot easier, which again broadens the audience and makes it easier to get that money back. So one of the trends that we were seeing right before the current consoles were released, was the push towards digital downloads and digital gaming versus disc-based media. And one of the problems with that is the actual storage. Now, when the PS3 and the Xbox 360 released, they started with 20 gigabytes of storage, which sounds absurd at this point in time. Eventually they were seeing bumps up. The PS3 had a couple of standards. They had the 20 gig, the 60 gig, the 80 gig. Eventually they raised to 40 gig. And soon we started seeing 120 gigs and 250 gigs and 500 gigs as well towards the end of their lives. So as we saw this push for digital media and things like that, it seemed like a necessary step that these consoles would have to launch with at least a decent amount of storage within the 500 gigabyte range to possibly a terabyte. They did launch with 500 gigabyte standard, and now we're even starting to see them with terabyte drives. Now we're seeing a special edition Xbox One with a 1 terabyte hybrid drive in it that's coming out soon. So that push towards digital media has definitely seen an increase in the storage amounts that these consoles are holding. So besides the proprietary hardware of the last generation consoles, one of the other major issues with them in terms of limiting their power and making them a little bit difficult to develop for was the lack of memory. The PS3 had a split 256 megabyte memory setup, and 256 megabytes for the GPU and 256 megabytes for the CPU. Now I believe on the PS3 there was a way for, I believe it was the CPU that could actually draw from the GPU's memory if necessary, But overall, 512 megabytes is a very, very low amount, even for a console setup. And the 360 had 512 megabytes as well, but it was a shared pool amongst the GPU and the CPU. And the GPU actually had, I believe it was 10 megabytes of embedded RAM as well that it could draw from. So that said, it was kind of easy to think that, this generation would see a huge bump in the memory increase, not even the normal bump from, the last generation, that we would see something that went kind of a little bit beyond that and made it a little bit future-proof in a way. In my predictions, I said that we would see at least 6 gigabytes of RAM, and they actually both launched with shared pools of 8 gigabytes. And 8 gigabytes, especially when you're talking about a console at this point and for the foreseeable future, is actually a decent amount. It's beyond what I actually even expected to see in them. If you're sharing between a CPU and a GPU 8 gigabytes, it's a pretty decent amount. I mean, most high-end GPUs are just starting to get 4 gigabytes standard for their memory, and 8 gigabytes has kind of become the standard for system memory for the PC. Really, when you're talking about a console which doesn't have as much going on in terms of using the memory, 8 gigabytes is a decent amount. So the fact that they have a ample amount of storage, and it's actually fast memory as well, that's something that they definitely did well with this console generation, and it was in line with my prediction. It actually exceeded my prediction as well. So those were my predictions for the current generation of consoles that I made kind of right before they release. Like I said, we're not going to see another generation of consoles for about 5-6 years maybe down the road, but I feel like it's time to throw down some predictions right now and, see where they land when those consoles release. So my first prediction, which is probably pretty obvious, is that the next generation is going to target 4K resolution as their standard. Now, just like when the PS3 and the 360 released, 720p was kind of the popular standard, and 1080p was still out of a lot of people's reach in terms of being able to actually afford it. This generation saw 1080p within a lot of people's reach and kind of the standard, and 4K just a little bit out of people's reach. And the price on 4K TVs and 4K PC monitors as well is dropping very, very quickly. They're almost at the point where they're not that much different from a 1080p TV of a similar size. So it makes sense that when we see the next generation of consoles, we're at least going to see an aim for 4K gaming, being a standard. Now, the difficulty with that is going to be the actual power of those consoles being able to handle it. I mean, I imagine in 5-6 years we should be there, but you never know. I mean, most modern GPUs for the PC are struggling to keep up with 4K at any kind of decent frame rate at this point, especially when you crank up the settings a bit. So who knows where we'll be in 5-6 years, but if I had to hazard a guess, my prediction would be that we're going to see 4K as at least the standard. So before this generation released, a lot of people felt like we were going to see consoles without any kind of disc-based media. My prediction was that we were going to see Blu-ray, which we did, because I don't think we're there yet in terms of being only digital for especially for console gaming. And my prediction for the next generation is basically the same. I don't think we're going to see consoles that release without any kind of disc at all. I think we're at least going to see maybe a new standard or a revision of Blu-ray, something like that in there. I don't think that even in 5 or 6 years we're going to be quite ready for a discless gaming console. As far as the PC goes, which is usually a little bit ahead of the time, PC gamers generally tend to have a higher end setup in terms of internet connection, things like that. We're probably going to see most people shy away from discs in their systems, but I don't think the consoles are going to quite be there yet. I don't think people who are buying consoles are going to be able to have a strong enough internet connection to handle that. I don't think the consoles are going to be able to include quite enough storage without bumping up the price significantly. So I really don't think that we're going to see a completely discless console. Now, that said, one of my other predictions is going to be that I think we'll see a version of the consoles that come without any kind of disc drive, possibly a cheaper version of it, possibly an alternative version of the console that we'll see, which won't include any kind of disk drive. And as the generation progresses, it is possible that we might see a system that releases without any kind of disk. Basically a slim version of the consoles that just doesn't have a disk drive. So the new kind of hot thing in video games is virtual reality. Now, much like motion-based controls and 3D gaming, virtual reality may just be a gimmick that's not really here to stay. Now, I know 3D gaming is kind of it's always kind of been on the edge of a gimmick. I mean, that's one where developers did support it pretty well, and people did adopt it fairly well, but it never really caught on mainstream, I would say. You know, most people out there are not playing their games in 3D. Though we had huge success with motion-based controls, but the Xbox and the PlayStation trying to emulate that hasn't really done well or caught on. I mean, people kind of revolted when Xbox One was going to require Kinect in order to work. Part of that had to do with some privacy concerns, but a lot of that also had to do with people reacting to kind of a gimmicky control scheme. VR seems to have a little bit more of a chance than those other technologies. There's a ton of support within the console space. There's a ton of support outside of gaming as well. There's a ton of support from, you know, companies like HTC and Valve. They've teamed up together to give us virtual reality gaming. You have Samsung giving us, you know, virtual reality gaming. Google, you have, you know, there's a ton of support for virtual reality, more so than we really ever saw with 3D or motion controls, things like that. So virtual reality does have a decent chance. Problem is, it's not quite there yet. In the way it stands now, it's definitely better than anything we saw in the 90s when virtual reality kind of had a resurgence, but it's nothing great at this point. It still has a lot of hurdles to overcome in terms of latency and visuals and things like that as well. Not to mention, you know, you're putting on these fairly large goggles. I mean, they've definitely come a long way in terms of comfort and size, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Similar to 3D and 3D glasses that you're kind of required or were required to wear. That said, also, I think that for the next generation, I think that we will be there for virtual reality 5 or 6 years, especially with the push that we're seeing now. It very well may be that these consoles are, you know, entrenched in virtual reality gaming. That might be their thing. That might be the next big thing in gaming, and that's kind of where I see it going. I think that at the very least they're going to put a large emphasis on virtual reality gaming. So thanks for watching my predictions for the next generation of console gaming. So I want to hear from you guys. What are some of your predictions for the next generation of console gaming? Where do you see gaming as it is now? Where do you see it going to? What did you think of my predictions? Do you think that I'm going to be accurate, or do you think I'm kind of completely off base here? So as always, if you like what you see, subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment down below of anything you want to see from me or what you think of my predictions, and what are some of your predictions.